Welcome to the Ex Terra Podcast. The Ex Terra mission is to explore and discuss the business of space and its effect on the national and global economy, as well as life on Earth. How does what happens in space affect your life every day? That's what we're exploring on the Ex Terra website, as well as on this podcast. My guest for this program is Katherine Gizinski, Chief Executive Officer for ManSat, a company specializing in obtaining international recognition for frequency assignments at the International Telecommunications Union. Katherine, thank you for joining me on the Ex Terra Podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Give me a little bit more detailed description of what it is that ManSat actually does.
Sure. So we focus on access to spectrum internationally. About 20 years ago, our founder saw an opportunity that access to spectrum was a huge stumbling block to the major operators and ultimately served to be a very confusing process. And so 20 years later, here we are, we're the largest commercial provider of spectrum in the world, and we offer a whole suite of support services, regulatory support services for our clients. Everything from end-to-end management of spectrum and spectrum regulatory matters to ad hoc support for specific projects.
What are some of those regulatory issues that you have to get into?
Sure. So at an international level, regulation of space activity, as I will describe it, falls into three major categories. So you have regulation of the spectrum, which is our wheelhouse, regulation of the spacecraft itself, which has to do with liability for what that physical body does in space, and then market access or landing rights, which really has to do with where and in what countries and what markets you want to provide services. And so that's where the first vertical spectrum bleeds over into the third, and we play in both of those spaces. And when it comes to the regulatory considerations that we get into and that are really critical for the space industry, the reality is the RF spectrum is a finite resource. And each little sliver of spectrum is a piece of real estate that's necessary for us to operate successfully in space and peacefully in space. And so the regulatory considerations can range from just navigating the established regulatory framework, the established process to make sure you can access the spectrum you need to operate, to advocating for new allocations, or within a given country, establishing a new regulatory framework, as we've done in the Isle of Man and in Iceland, as well as working with other regulators globally.
How and when did ManSat get started?
Well, about 20 years ago now, our founder and now chairman, Chris Stott, was selling rides to space, and he heard from a lot of the operators, they were ready to pull the trigger on buying a launch vehicle, but kept hearing this issue of, well, we don't have our spectrum yet. Well, we really don't have our spectrum yet. And so if you know Chris, you know what an entrepreneur he is, and he is curious. And so he started digging into that a little bit. So, what is this process? What's this problem? What's holding everybody up? And so he saw an opportunity to bring transparency and clarity to, again, an otherwise very confusing and in some ways ill-defined process. That's how we started, and again, have just grown from there, from Isle of Man to Iceland, and then of course into our consulting services.
So how crowded is the satellite frequency spectrum?
That is an excellent question, and a sticky one, because it depends on which pieces of the spectrum you're looking at. So at a high level, spectrum is a limited natural resource. The rules of the road are established by the ITU, so we have an understanding of how to effectively use and share the spectrum. But some of those regulations, some of that framework is being stress tested by new technologies, new capabilities, and just frankly, the volume of demand and the volume of new systems. So bearing in mind this is a finite natural resource, when we look at the numbers, there are tremendously more geostationary and non-geostationary systems, including CubeSats, than we've ever seen before. More than 100 different countries, member nation states of the ITU, are now submitting satellite filings for systems to the ITU. And to put a finer point on it, there are more than 4,000 unique filings in the ITU databases. And while these numbers sound extremely daunting, there's still some opportunities out there if you are prepared to really tackle this problem at the outset of a new satellite system. It's sort of like solving an equation with three unknowns. You have your orbital slot or orbit for non-geostationary filing. You have the frequencies you intend to operate in, and then the service area. And what we do is we help identify the triplet that maximizes those constraints, which is no small feat because, of course, there are a number of folks that have a number of systems that are in process. There's a little bit of science, a little bit of math, and a little bit of art to that of which systems will be successful, which systems are most concerning. And so, again, really maximizing that triplet of constraints is no small feat, and that's something we specialize in.
What frequencies do you normally operate in? Is there a certain kind of spectrum that you have to deal with?
Sure. So we work across a range of frequencies depending on the system. The easy picks for geostationary systems versus non-geostationary systems vary. And as we're seeing more interest in commercial moon and deep space missions, I expect our mix of frequencies will change. We're certainly seeing a lot of discussion and a lot of question about, what have in the past been historically less used bands, for instance, Q and V bands. It's now a hot commodity. And coming out of WRC 19, of course, we saw a lot of changes to the regulations to keep in step with the changing landscape in terms of use and interest in that band. But we're pretty diversified across frequencies, again, depending on the system, depending on the operation.
Frequency allocation has been an issue as long as there's been broadcasting. Back in the day when they were establishing the first terrestrial radio systems and the FCC had to coordinate all of the frequencies, they had clear channels that were opened up. They had a whole lot of interference issues. And then I recall when back then Sirius satellite radio was first coming online that became Sirius XM, there was a lot of talk about the interference between the XM frequency and adjacent frequencies and those kinds of things. Is that the kind of thing that ManSat tends to deal with?
So yes, and even more broadly than that. So, when you step back and think about international spectrum regulation, there's the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, that establishes it's a standards body as well as an enforcing arm of the UN. So it's establishing the radio regulations, the standards at an international level. But then when you go down to the national level, each country it's their prerogative to choose to overlay their own regulation on top of those international standards according to their policy priorities. And we deal in both at the international level and at the national level. And it is a complicated issue, and there are a number of challenges. Certainly the technical challenges, frequency coordination with nearby systems, satellite systems, and certainly on the ground, but also business side negotiations. Operators provide global services, and the commercial considerations, the commercial negotiations can be similarly, same but different, similarly complex and challenging. And then another facet to it is at the international stage, depending on the applicable regulation when it comes to frequency coordination, those agreements carry significant weight. There are diplomatic considerations, and frequency coordination agreements can be, treaty level agreements. And so all that to say, yes, very complicated, both technically, commercially, and diplomatically to navigate those waters.
Is technology making it easier for there to be less interference between satellite frequencies and satellite communications?
That's a great question. So there have been technological advances that, to those of us who have been in industry for a while, sort of boggle our mind. And the idea of efficient use of spectrum it's a problem that we've been trying to solve for a long time, and there are different ways to solve it. How can you share? How can you reuse it? Whether it's because we don't have enough or because it's expensive to get what you need. So there are certainly technological advances, tremendous technological advances that help us use spectrum more efficiently and can help us address interference issues. But that's not the whole problem, because the regulations are by design not laid out in anticipation of future technologies. So every 3 to 4 years, the ITU has a World Radio Conference. Last one was in 2019. Next one's WRC 23. And that is the forum where the regulations can change. And to affect change typically takes about 2 cycles. You need 1 cycle to get an item on the agenda, typically studies follow, and at least 1 more cycle to actually have a finding found, have any changes come into effect. And we know why. You know, we don't want our regulation being too reactive and changing the sand underneath our feet. But that does mean that when we have those tremendous technological improvements, we have them, we know they're there. They can certainly inform some of the frequency coordination discussions, but the allocations and the established regulation may not yet reflect those changes. There's a little bit of a push and pull between the regs and the technical capability.
So you're seeing the regulations essentially lag behind the technology. By the time an 8-year cycle has gone by, they say, well, here are new regulations, and the technology has completely changed because we know how fast that technology does change.
Potentially. I mean, and I will say, to the ITU's credit, understanding the burden they carry, and while there are a number of huge global corporations that have billions of dollars riding on this, and a tremendous number of jobs and this entire economy on their shoulders, they also have a peacekeeping responsibility to ensure no harmful interference leads to any undesired effects, again, between nations. And so I would say, certainly, there's always going to be a lag between when the technology advances and when the regulation can respond to it. But the ITU has done a phenomenal job of engaging with industry, really trying to look at what streamlined processes it can implement to support some of the rapid innovation that we are seeing, but also, in strict adherence with their charter, make sure that they are carrying out their function effectively. And I don't envy that balance. That's a really hard one to strike, and I think they've done a great job of trying to move in the right direction without causing any external effects that none of us would want ultimately.
What are some of the main differences in different countries' spectrum rules?
Yeah, that's another good one. So each country can, again, overlay its own regulations on top of the ITU regs. So an example there that I could point to would be S-band for space operations. So it's one of the most common bands in Europe for new space ventures and for scientific projects. But in the US, it's primarily allocated for federal use. And there are a couple of ways to navigate that process. But again, if you're a U.S. entity looking to access spectrum through the U.S., you've got to grapple with the fact, well, this band that's available to my competitors overseas is not available to me according to the letter of the regs. And again, every market has the ability to do that, has the ability to overlay regulation on top of the radio regs in accordance with their policy priorities. The other difference is when it comes to market access. So the market access landscape can vary a lot from one country to another, and it's not just about what spectrum is accessible, but also the licensing practices can be very different. The UK tends to be a little bit lighter touch in terms of provision of electronic communication, and it doesn't necessarily require notification of the local telecom regulator. On the other side, we've got France that doesn't require a permit, but does require you file a declaration. And so some of it is terminology and process and paperwork difference. But ultimately, each country you want to serve has its own process, its own regulations, and its own priorities. And so When we talk to some of these new space startups, especially that have in mind global services, global operations, we have to have a really frank conversation about what does that look like, and what kind of undertaking that is, and the time, the effort, the resources that go into obtaining landing rights, market access in your tier 1, tier 2, and so on countries, and how do you support the business case necessary to justify a new system.
You're listening to the Ex Terra Podcast. I'm Tom Patton, and my guest is Katherine Gizinski, Chief Executive Officer from ManSat. Katherine, you mentioned something a few moments ago that I found interesting when you started talking about the CubeSats and the huge constellations of satellites that are being putting up. And I'm thinking of SpaceX with Starlink, and OneWeb will be coming online, and I'm sure that other countries are seeing their own development in those kinds of satellite constellations. How does that, with hundreds literally or potentially of satellites operating on the same frequency, how does that affect the allocation of that spectrum? Because they're all going to be on the same frequency essentially, but there's a lot of them.
Yes, so there are established regulations when it comes to that, and I won't go too deep in the weeds of the applicable regulation, but absolutely. I mean, ultimately, if you have a system that's established, that's already claimed its spectrum, then it is a challenge. It's certainly a challenge to say you're going to go to that operator and provide a sound and solid technical argument that you can operate within the close to them, within the same band, without causing harmful interference. There are absolutely established coordination procedures for the majority of the bands being used for those constellations, but it's something that's huge. And again, talking about the ITU process and access to spectrum, assured access to spectrum, the ITU works on fundamentally a first come, first served basis. Okay. So when you go to the ITU, you make a satellite filing, and then you have 7 years to use or lose your spot in line functionally. And once you claim or bring into use your spectrum, depending on the applicable regulation and the given band, it's yours. And so anybody that comes after you would have to coordinate with you. And likewise, if you're making a new filing, you've got to look to who's ahead of you. Is it practical? Is it technically feasible? And is it practical for me to think that I can use the spectrum that somebody else has already claimed? And that's, again, where the combination of both the technical considerations and the technical aspect of coordination, as well as the commercial arrangements, come into play. And I have to say, there have been a number of situations where, from a technical perspective, you walk into a frequency coordination discussion and you think, I don't see a technical solution that everyone's going to be happy with, but there is a commercial solution. And so as long as you come to the table with an open mind, hopefully on both sides, there's certainly a lot of room to grow the space industry into the robust, multi-billion, coming up on $1 trillion industry that we all want to see.
When you look at satellites that can potentially use multiple frequencies off the same bird, does that present a particular challenge? Have you come up against that kind of a situation?
Sure. Yeah, that's not from our perspective. That doesn't pose a unique challenge to us inherently. Of course, the more complex the system, the more complex the spectrum consideration. But inherently, it's not a big hindrance. It's just a matter of, okay, here are the applicable regulations in each of these bands, and here are the parties we need to work with, and here are the coordination concerns we need to resolve. And then, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? You just break it into pieces, and we can address each of those.
Are there advantages to being located on the Isle of Man?
Yes, in short. So, when we started 20 years ago, one of the reasons we chose the Isle of Man as a jurisdiction that we wanted to cultivate in terms of access to spectrum and satellite filings is, well, there were 3 components to it. Stable government, stable rule of law, and then, I'd say pro-space business. And so the Isle of Man has all three of those. And likewise, Iceland are another jurisdiction we now support: stable government, stable rule of law, and pro-space. Those are key and fundamental. And you can see in some of the high-profile bankruptcies and reorganizations that have happened in the industry, the value of spectrum and the ability to resurrect that asset from the ashes is a huge emphasis. And so we wanted to make sure that any jurisdiction we worked in, was as resilient and supportive of its space companies as it could be, and practically minded. Another benefit, of course, to the Isle of Man is there's a 0% rate of corporate tax on the space industry. And I think we're now up to over 50 satellite operators that have a presence on the Isle of Man. So it's used for a lot on the regulatory side, a lot on the fundraising side, joint ventures, and so on. So it's a great place for the space industry.
Has the COVID pandemic affected your business at all?
Differently than others, I would say. From our perspective, the regulatory landscape, it keeps going. The regulatory deadlines aren't relaxed because of COVID. The necessity of access to spectrum hasn't changed. Some of our operators have adjusted their launch timelines based on manufacturing delays, but functionally, the regulatory environment hasn't, I won't say hasn't changed, hasn't eased up on the demands. There's certainly been changes in terms of the ITUs working from home, the regulators are working from home, and I would say collectively, everyone has done a phenomenal job of, over the past year, adapting and overcoming those challenges. The one thing that's a little bit, I would say a little bit up in the air is the effect this will have on preparation efforts for WRC 23. There's something to be said for getting folks from around the world in one location to work through some of these complex issues. When everyone's distributed and attending virtually, juggling time zones and a number of other factors and limiting those meetings to a few hours a day is a challenge. And I think that could slow things down. I think we have the potential to recover that time. But I would say that's an area I'm keeping an eye on for, I would say, effects that last a bit longer than when we all go back to the office.
What services does ManSat offer beyond spectrum allocation services?
Sure. So spectrum allocation or access to spectrum is one of many services that we offer. And it's typically part of I'd say an end-to-end or one-stop shop offering that we bring to our clients. So we help also identify the right spectrum and secure those rights, and then obtain market access, again, globally, which goes far beyond, I shouldn't say it's a small piece, but obtaining the frequencies, obtaining international regulation of frequency assignments from the ITU is huge, and it's necessary to obtain market access. But that market access component is that, that's how you make your money. That's how you justify the business case. And we absolutely help with that on a global basis. And then again, where no framework exists, we can help our operators work with their regulators to shape that framework. And likewise, we worked with a number of governments, a number of regulators to help shape their frameworks. And of course, always and critically, that knowledge transfer. Another interesting thing we've been working with lately really speaks to, I'd say, the vacuum in the industry when it comes to attracting and retaining good talent, especially in this area. I mean, there's a small pool of folks that have this sort of expertise. And so one of the things we've been working on with a number of our clients, both large and small and everywhere in between, is helping them onboard the right regulatory folks. In some cases, that means bringing somebody with a little bit less experience on, but investing for 1, maybe 2 years in that person to bring them up to speed so that they are a fully capable and vital part of the team. And as I mentioned, I mean, this is a hugely critical part of making a business case close and supporting a system's operation. So that onboarding process can't be overlooked. So all that to say, one of our new services is working with our clients to bring on new team members, onboard them, train them up, transfer the knowledge, while simultaneously, of course, executing on any outstanding regulatory items that won't wait for someone to get trained up, and then providing ongoing oversight and support to make sure that person integrates well into the team, is demonstrating their grasp of the issues, and again, a check-in to make sure all is progressing well, which we've found has been really useful for our clients that know they need a bigger team, are struggling to find that expertise within the industry from other satellite operators or from consultants, and don't have the time. Like I said, investing 1 to 2 years to cultivate multiple folks on the team is no small bit of time. So that's been a really interesting piece for us too.
Let's talk about the Picasso mission that launched last October, kind of as a case study. How did ManSat support that mission?
Sure. We were approached by the satellite manufacturer to assist with their regulatory issues, including preparation of all their submissions to the ITU, identifying other satellite operators they needed to coordinate with, and assisting with frequency coordination itself. And so in this case, the notifying administration was Belgium. And we work with many different operators and many different regulators globally. But we don't only support private or commercial entities. We also support administrations, like I mentioned. So two other jurisdictions we worked with around the same time are Poland and Malta. And that was to implement a WRC 19 decision related to upgrading their BSS assignments. And so we identified the optimum orbital slots, frequencies, and prepared this filing, again, end-to-end management for them. And finally, finished with training and knowledge transfer, which, like I mentioned, is a priority for every one of our clients, to make sure that it's not just take this problem off my plate, also that they feel comfortable with the knowledge base we leave them with.
What kind of, for lack of a better term, support after the sale do you offer? Is it done once they're launched and up and operating, or do you follow through with your clients and help them as their mission proceeds?
Yep, our relationships are long-standing. So the job of frequency coordination is never done. Once a system is up and operational, every subsequent filing has to be addressed. Every subsequent filing that comes along and says, hey, I'd like to coordinate with you. Well, as the existing system, if you don't defend your spectrum, then you're not doing your job. And so our support for them continues, again, for the life cycle of the system. And likewise, even once the system's replaced, there's a couple of different flavors you can think of when it comes to geostationary, non-geostationary, or mission-oriented systems. But ultimately, our operators, we have relationships that are decades or more in length. So we see it as a long-term relationship where we really are integral support for our clients.
We've got about a minute left. Who else is on your team? You want to give props to some folks that kind of work behind the scenes?
Sure, absolutely. So I have a phenomenal executive staff. Dr. Jennifer Stone leads our technical operations. She is our primary liaison with the administration through the Isle of Man as well as Iceland. She's been fantastic and with us for a number of years. In fact, the first recipient of our scholarship we provide in the Isle of Man, and she came back around as worked for us, and that investment in corporate social responsibility in our community has paid off dividends. So she's fantastic, and again has been terrific in supporting our clients. Alex Martin leads our consulting group, and again has really these service offerings that provide a suite of options for our clients. It's his brainchild. He's done a phenomenal job really listening to the market and responding to the needs right now and the needs to come in the next 5 to 10 years.
Speaking of the next 5 to 10 years, let's wrap up with that. How do you see the commercial space industry in the next 5 to 10 years, and what do you hope will be ManSat's future?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, it's really fascinating to me. Right now is a phenomenal time to be in the space industry. There's tremendous innovation. There's a lot of change. And I'd say there's willingness to think outside of the box. Things are happening now that just a decade ago were sort of unbelievable to even think about it being possible. And so to me, the commercial space industry, I'd say, is ready to be shaped. Something that's really interesting to us is what's happening in commercial missions to the moon and to deep space, and what's going to evolve there from a regulatory perspective. That's an area we've been focused on for a couple of years now, and it's a big focus of ours. And so, from my perspective, I see our future as absolutely investing in the next generation of regulatory expertise, folks that understand and appreciate what's been done in the past, what technology is doing, where it's headed, and how to support the innovation and the economic growth that's absolutely what we're standing in front of in the next 5 to 10 years. And likewise, for ManSat, we want to be part of that evolution, part of bringing in that next generation, but also really looking towards what the economy can look like when we go beyond our Earth-centric context and look at the moon and look at deep space. So that's what we're most excited about in the next 5 to 10 years. So buckle up, everybody. It's going to be fun.
That's what we're all hoping for. We're out of time, Katherine. Thanks so much for being our guest on the Ex Terra podcast.
My pleasure.
Katherine Gizinski is Chief Executive Officer from ManSat, a company specializing in obtaining international recognition for frequency assignments at the International Telecommunications Union. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra podcast. Find us on the web at xterrajsc.com. And be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter at XTerraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for listening.